Weary eyes opened to take in a dim and painful flickering glow of torches. The damp and cold walls around were dark, clammy, and disgusting, with no light save for a single torch beyond iron bars. The scurrying of rats, the dripping of water from the ceiling, and the subtle moan of prisoners in various cells, just like this one, were the only sound that could be heard. The man felt tired and hungry. It wouldn't be long before food was brought. He could always tell when the sound of mice and rats was loudest, because it meant food was on the way. He would have to snatch it before they could, but he was used to that. Whether it was fighting vermin for scraps or fighting men on the field of battle, this man was no stranger to death and carnage. In fact, it was the only reason he still breathed, because none could kill him, though many had tried. The lion would not yield. Godrick Lydis is not a man easily destroyed. "Hey, Lydis!" There was the sound of the guard. Lydis sat up from his cot, his body shifting and displacing the musty air. There stood a conqueror by the bars of the door. Beside him was a warmonger holding a tray of bread and a goblet of water. Next to the bread was a small cut of cheese. The conqueror had his helm off, showing his bald head and long, ugly scar over his left eye socket where the eye was missing. Everyone in the dungeon called him Righty because of that missing eye, and anyone who did got a lashing. The warmonger was Seline. She was of a gentle stock and kinder nature than most of her fellow disciples of Astria. Still young and naive, she was still in training and had not been blessed with a demon name yet. She was not cut out for war, which made Lydis wonder why she was in the company of such savages as these. She must have her reasons. Lydis did not answer, but sat up straight and glared at Righty. Righty snarled back. "What with that look, Lydis?" There was no response. "Nothing to say?"
"Give it a rest, Volk," Seline grumbled. "It's not worth it."
"I'll decide what's worth what. He's my prisoner, this is my dungeon, and all these scum are mine to do with as I please. Remember that, girl." Seline fell silent as Righty's spittle flew at her. There were low growls from the other cells. Referring to himself as their owners was not what the other inmates wanted to hear. Righty ignored them as he always did. "So, if I want to mock a wounded lion, then I'll do so. If I want to watch him squirm at my feet and bark like the dog he is, then I will. Isn't that right, Lydis?" Lydis's eyes bore into Righty, and for the briefest of moments the bravado shrank back. Somewhere in his conscious mind, Volk knew that the only reason he still drew breath was because of the bars between them, and provoking Godrick, imprisoned though he was not good for his health. Still, the man was a foolish and self-important oaf, and his bravado quickly swelled back in like water rushing to fill a cup. "Well, speak up for yourself, or has my prison finally tamed your tongue?" "Among wolves," Lydis growled coldly, "it is the weakest of the pack who howls the loudest. If only so he can pretend he's important." Seline looked away fast to stop herself from laughing, while Volk's face went a shade of crimson that was difficult to see in the bad lighting. "The hell did you say to me?" he snapped. Godrick rose to his feet and walked to the cell bar so he was face to face with Volk in his single eye. "Why ask me to repeat myself, Volk? Do you enjoy being shamed so much?" Lydis challenged. Volk roared and grabbed the tunic of Godrick's tattered top and yanked him against the bars with a sound like a gong as their heads crashed. The two men were face to face. All that was between them were the bars of the cell, the only thing stopping this from turning into a brawl. "I'll teach you some respect, you son of a—" His hand went to the cell door to rip it open and punish Lydis, but the instant his hand grabbed for the lock, he froze as his eyes saw Lydis's gaze, and he saw his fist clench hard, prepared to strike. He realized the mistake he'd almost made, and stepped back, spitting at Godrick. "At least this wolf still has his pack," Volk snarled back. "Seline, feed this bastard and get on with your chores." He then began walking down the dungeon path, shouting and berating the other inmates to fix his bruised ego. Seline shook her head and knelt down, sliding the tray through a small opening under the bars. She looked to Lydis, who sighed and sat down in defeat. It seemed, despite how stupid he seemed, Volk was not fool enough to open the cell door and give Godrick a chance to escape. Seline smiled apologetically.
You know, you shouldn't provoke him, Godrick.
And he should know better than to taunt a room full of dangerous inmates, Godrick responded. This dungeon does not house lambs meant for slaughter, but caged beasts who wish only to see him and his ilk dead. He would do well to remember that. Godrick stood up and approached the tray. He took it gratefully and sat down as Seline waited for him to return the tray to her. It was important he not keep the tray. He could potentially break it to pieces and then use the metal of it as a weapon. But Seline was fine waiting a few moments. After all, though he was on the side of her enemies, Godrick Lydis was a legend in the flesh, and just looking at him was enough to make her excited. His gray beard, though a bit unkempt now, framed his face like a lion's mane, and his white hair fell down just past his neck. He had firm, cold eyes that still burned with a fierce intensity. His body was chiseled and toned like a statue, and his hands were calloused from handling weaponry all his life. He was in his 50s, no doubt, and yet his body radiated an energy that made him seem half that age. This was Godrick Lydis, the last lion of the Vigil Arca. A warrior of such rapport that even having him in this dungeon had made this fortress, modest and small though it was, the talk of Horkos for months since his capture. Since then, he'd been paraded before officers and captains of Horkos, including Vela, Ravier, and Vortiger himself. He had been insulted, berated, whipped, spat at, and flogged. Now all that remained was his execution. This would take place just at the end of the week, and Astria herself would come to do the deed. It was a shame, Seline thought, but that was the way things went. She watched as the warrior ate his bread, and he glanced at her. You seem an odd flower to be growing in a garden of briars, he remarked. Seline blushed and shook her head. Horkos was there for me when no one else was, she answered, when that cult, the servants of the stake, ravaged Ashfeld. They burned my village to the ground and used many as sacrifices. I escaped and fled to Horkos for aid, and they sent the Inquisition to save my village. In gratitude for this, I gladly offer my services to Astria and her order. I am honored to be trained as a warmonger of Horkos. Godrick listened to her without looking. A dark cloud passed across his face. Have you returned to your home since this happened? He asked. No, Seline answered weakly. My duties here are quite extensive, and I'm not permitted to leave, though I do write home regularly. I see. He said no more and turned his attention back to his food. When he finished the bread, he dug into the cheese and the water. Seline watched, and she felt a question fill her tongue like the water itself. She felt it about to burst from her lips, and she could hold it in no more. What became of the lions of Vigil Arca? The question made Godrick stop drinking and turn his gaze to Seline. Feeling she'd spoken out of turn, she knelt back down and bowed her head, but to her surprise, Godrick spoke. You've heard the story, I'm sure. Yes, we all have, but... She gulped and pushed herself to speak up. But you were there, sire. And I want to know what really happened. Godrick looked to her. Their eyes met, and they held a gaze for a moment. But after what felt like a few minutes, Godrick nodded his head. I will tell you, he answered, but only if you make me a promise. At this, Seline looked skeptical. I won't open your cell and let you go. I can't, she shouted. At this, Godrick smirked. Tempting as that may be. No, that is not the promise I ask of you. I will ask for something else from you. But we can save that for after my story. About how I became the last lion of the Vigil Arca. He sat down his goblet of water and inhaled slowly to begin his tale. As you well know, Holden Cross was the first Gryphon. He gave himself that title after his many years wandering the world and learning from various peoples, nations, and cultures. He so named himself after the mythical beast, which is made of the parts of lions and eagles, to be as regal and mighty as the lion, but with the grace and the nobility of the eagle, to hold in one hand the cunning of the raptor, and in the other the strength of the lion. It was a name he was worthy to carry, but he was not alone. Many mercenaries that traveled with him desired to take up the name of Gryphon as well. Leaving their bands and nations behind them, they took up the Bardiche and followed Holden to a sacred fortress, hidden in the heart of Ashfeld, the Vigil Arca, the Sentinel Fortress.
In ancient days, this fortress was the last bastion of defense for the people of Ashfeld. When the great cataclysm shook the land, it is said that the unsung knight herself rallied the knightly orders of Ashfeld at that very place to make their stand to push out the invading Vikings and samurai. It's hallowed ground, and such hallowed ground would serve as a fine place for Holden to begin training in raising new griffins. The griffins, though trained in the ways of knights, were never strictly bound to the codes of Ashfeld. Holden encouraged each trainee to think and live by their own codes, their own standards of morality, and their own ideals. As he had learned from his mistakes in the Blackstone Legion, to relinquish who you are for the sake of obedience to an earthly master or code is foolish. Instead, Holden wanted the Griffins to fight for higher things than merely factions, or for war or for peace. He wanted us to fight for what we saw to be righteous. The Vigil Arca was more than a training fortress for Griffins. It was a school, teaching language skills, combat arts, writing, reading, and problem-solving. As more mercenaries and knights came to learn and study under Holden, he realized quickly he could not possibly manage such a feat alone. So from among his disciples, he chose 20 of his finest friends and allies among the Griffins, who he named the Lions of Vigil Arca. Seline knew all of this, of course, and yet she hung on every word, enraptured by the story. Godrick noted this and smiled before carrying on. Of course, none of this is news to you. I'm sure you could even name some of my fellow lions if I asked you to. She nodded silently, and Godrick chuckled. I'll save you the trouble. In any case, yes. That was almost 8 years ago, as I recall. For 6 long years since our founding, the Lions were tasked with overseeing the training, teaching, and education of Griffins who would go out and aid whatever cause they deemed righteous. For a time, we were pleased. We clashed with Horkos on a few occasions, but the strength of the Griffins and the Lions of the Vigil Arca were always enough to hold off the tide of Astria's attacks. However, time began to change us. Godrick's face fell slightly, a shadow drifting over his eyes as he bowed his head. Some of us, some of the Lions, we became divided. Holden, you see, had helped Hervis Daubeny build up Chimera into an actual fighting force in Feronia, and he spent much of his time there, trying to hold together that new, fledgling organization. The Lions were left to hold Vigil Arca themselves, to continue the training of Griffins ourselves, and some of us were fed up with the calling.
How do you mean?
Seline asked. To be a Griffin is not a simple task. Much is demanded of us. Beyond the rigors of the education and training, there are the vows we take, the oaths we swear to hold fast to righteousness. We were taught self-control, to abstain from sinful and wicked deeds that would corrupt our core tenets. And it is a bitter pill for a man to swallow that asks him to abandon his baser motives and cling to righteousness. Man, at its core, is weak, as is the flesh. Desire for wanton pleasures and desires led some, even among the Lions, to begin defiling Vigil Arca. 8 of our number specifically led a band of our fellows into a nearby town and raided it. They absconded with copious amounts of treasures, alcohol, and even some poor daughters and wives not theirs for the taking.
By God, Seline gasped, how could they do such a thing?
It's not that we Griffins could not enjoy alcohol, money, or sex. Not at all. Many had wives or families, and we all enjoyed wines and meads on occasion. But when you're surrounded every day by brothers, reminded by them constantly of your vows and expectations to show restraint, sometimes the need to break your chains, to indulge, to take in excess, it becomes a great burden. We Lions, above all, were encouraged to be examples to our charges, to be models of this righteousness. So for some of us, that was just too hard to handle.
It's distasteful, Seline wrinkled her nose, to so casually abandon your honor for such awful things.
Godrick nodded his head. Yes, that is how my fellows thought as well. When the 8 and their fellow collaborators returned with their spoils, we made a move to detain them, but we were amazed to discover that some of our fellow lions had allied with Horkos, and when we rode out to meet our brothers, we were met by an ambush. I was there that day. There where the wrath of those traitors fell upon us. Horkos saw this as their opportunity to seize the fortress of Vigil Arca for themselves. We were forced to battle our brothers, as well as the forces of Horkos. Godrick looked up past Seline, as if gazing into a distant memory. I had never known such chaos in all my life. I watched countless fellows who I had known and fought with die and bleed in agony, in not only my hand, but at each other's hands. The battle was the worst I had ever been forced to fight in, and the fortress would surely have fallen to Horkos had Holden not arrived at daybreak with his Chimera allies. Horkos was forced to flee, and without Horkos' aid, the treacherous Gryphons were without their fangs and fled or died in the attempt. Godrick closed his eyes in frustrated snarls before leaning his head back against the cold and wet stones of his prison cell. Selina stared at the man, and in that instant she saw the age in his face, the years of stress, pain, and fatigue all weighing on him, in his silver hair, his lined cheeks, his weary brow.
What became of the loyal lions?
Most were killed in the ambush, Godrick answered sadly. A few still live, I believe, but they have either become so injured they can no longer fight, or they abandoned their titles and went their own way. I am the last of the lions of Vigil Arca.
What did Holden do? Seline asked.
Master Holden Cross, the first Gryphon. He was ashamed of what had befallen us, ashamed that so many had fallen to our baser instincts and fled our oaths and faithfulness. He deemed Vigil Arca unfit to be garrisoned. Not only did Horkos now know where it was, but we lacked the numbers to properly hold it. Some of the surviving Gryphons elected to follow him back to Feronia and join Chimera. Others he dismissed, allowing them to go where they chose and live as they wished. Some went to join the Knights, Samurai, Vikings, and Wulin. Some joined new mercenary companies and bandits. Others just vanished, settling into quiet lives to start families or to find wives of their own.
And you? Seline pushed. What did you do, Godrick?
Godrick shook his head heavily. Holden did nothing to me, child. He offered me the chance to join him in Feronia, but I declined. I had shamed the lions and himself, so I would not permit myself to abandon the title until I regained my lost honor. And there's only one way I can restore the honor of the lions. His eyes then flashed dangerously, and the ferocious snarl of Godrick flashed across his face. I must seek out the traitors, the ones who turned their back on Vigil Arca, and destroy them in honor of those who fell that day.
Wait, the traitors yet live? Seline cried. There are still lions of Vigil Arca active?
5 traitors live, Godrick answered. 1 died in the initial battle. 2 I have already met and vanquished. The other 5 yet live, though they go by new names now, I understand. Astria, in an attempt to mock our roles as Gryphons, redubbed them the Manticores.
Seline's hands flew to her mouth. I know them, she cried. The Manticores are the elite warriors of Horkos, Gryphons who abandoned Cross and Chimera. They lead detachment of Horkos soldiers to different locations around Heathmore at Astria's command. You mean they were once lions of Vigil Arca?
Indeed, Godrick snarled. Traitors all. And it is my solemn duty to slay every one of them.
Seline frowned and lowered her hands as Godrick slid his empty tray and goblet back to her, under the bars of his cell. She took them and then gazed at Godrick through apologetic eyes. I am sorry your quest ends here, my lord, she said. I have heard that Astria will arrive within the week. Your time draws near, I fear.
Godrick smiled at her with a look of surprising warmth. Fear not, dear girl, Godrick whispered. I have no fear of Astria or her plans for me.
You are most brave, sire. To have no fear of death. were I so courageous.
Let not your soul begin to doubt yourself. The man who is brave is no different from the man who is a coward. Both are afraid, but the difference is what one man chooses to do in the face of their fear and what the other man chooses not to do.
Seline looked at Godrick again, and there was a pause as the two took in the other. Godrick leaned forward a fraction and spoke with urgency.
I told you before that in exchange for the story you would fulfill a promise to me. And now I would ask you hear my petition.
I promise to do what I can, Seline agreed.
I want you, before daylight falls, to leave this fortress and return home to your village and see what has become of it, Godrick instructed.
What? Go home? Seline gasped. That's ridiculous. My commander would never allow permission for that, especially with Astria on her way, and besides, I have duties here that cannot be—
Seline, Godrick interrupted calmly, but with enough force that it caused Seline to fall silent. I want you to swear to me that tonight, before the sun finishes setting, you will leave this fortress and go home. When you do, take in what you learn there, and then ask yourself if you are a brave one or a coward. Ask yourself what you will do in the face of the truth.
There was a long and cold silence, and Seline, in the back of her heart, knew what Godrick was implying. She shook her head. My lord, you speak lies, surely.
You said you wish you had my bravery, Seline. This is your chance, Godrick snapped. Now swear to me that you will be gone from this fortress by sunset. Swear it.
Seline looked down at her feet and then bowed her head low. I swear, my lord. I swear it. But what of you? Godrick smiled at her as he ran his hands gently along a small object hidden just underneath his leg that he'd had hidden since he and Volk had nearly come to blows. The slight shine of metal under his body made Seline realize exactly what was hidden there.
I will continue my quest, he answered.
Seline nodded and quickly left the dungeons, not stopping to speak to Volk or anyone else as he made preparations to flee the fortress before the lion broke loose. 2 weeks later, in Feronia, Holden Cross listened to a distraught, weeping Seline explaining all of these things to him. The young woman went on to tell Cross about how she had fled to her hometown, to discover that there was nothing but a ruined and devastated hovel. Corpses were burnt and left in effigy bearing marks of the Inquisition as well as the servants of the stake. It was as Godrick had feared and had warned. The truth had been everything she'd feared, and facing it, she knew she could not return to Horkos afterward, so she made the only other choice she could, and now here she was, kneeling before Gryphon himself. When Gryphon heard all these things, he asked only one more question of the young warmonger.
What has become of my lion, Godrick? He asked.
Seline looked up at him and a faint smile crossed her face. When I rode for Feronia, I had to pass by the fortress he was held at along the road, and I saw columns of smoke rising from it. Though if he survived, I do not know.
I believe he did, Gryphon answered. My sources tell me Astria is most angry right now, which leads me to believe her prize has escaped her clutches. It would seem the lion hunts once again, and the manticores have reason to hide.